They thought a flatline meant the end. My daughter-in-law, a doctor, thought she could erase me with a few milligrams of digoxin. She stood there, watching the monitor, waiting for my heart to give up. Everyone believed the story she told them, that my mind was failing, that my heart was next. I let them believe it, because when people think you're dying, they stop watching what you're doing. What she didn't realize was that I wasn't reading those machines in my final moments. I was using them. And while she was waiting for my heart to stop, I was preparing the evidence that would end her career forever. The ballroom of the Miller Grand Hotel was shimmering with crystal chandeliers and the applause of 500 elite surgeons. I stood there, 75 years of life etched into my face, wearing my white coat like a suit of armor for the last time. My 40th anniversary, my legacy. Then came Elena. She didn't bring a toast. She didn't bring flowers. Slap! She didn't hit me with her hand, but it felt worse. She slammed a cold, plastic ultrasound film directly onto my chest, pinning it against my Medal of Honor. The ballroom went dead silent. The champagne bubbles seemed to freeze in the air. "Happy anniversary, Mother," Elena hissed, her voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "But let's be honest with your guests. You aren't retiring. You're expiring." She pointed at the film, a grainy, gray image of a heart that looked like a dying animal. "Look at this, everyone! Look at the great Margaret Miller!" She turned the film toward the front row. Her left ventricle is a cavern of failure. Ejection fraction? Barely 28%. This isn't a heart. It's a ticking time bomb. My husband and I cannot, in good conscience, let a woman with a rotting brain and a failing pump control the city's largest medical foundation. The humiliation was a physical weight. I could feel the eyes of my students, my rivals, my friends, all shifting from respect to pity. I looked at Arthur, my son. He was staring at his polished shoes, the cowardice radiating off him in waves. "Arthur," I whispered, letting my voice tremble, playing the part of the broken matriarch. "Not tonight. Please." "Tonight is the perfect night, Mom," Arthur mumbled, finally looking up, but his eyes were vacant. "You're 75. You're confused. You're sick. We're just taking the wheel before you crash the ship." Elena leaned in so close I could smell the cold metallic scent of the champagne on her breath. She slid a small amber bottle into my trembling hand. "Metoprolol, Mother. Take it. Keep that weak heart of yours quiet while we sign the transfer papers." I gripped the bottle. My fingers brushed the underside of my own wrist, a habit of 40 years. Thump, thump, thump. Strong, rhythmic, defiant. My radial pulse was a drumbeat of war. A perfect 72 beats per minute. Elena was a brilliant doctor, but she was a blinded predator. She was looking at a forged ultrasound, while I was feeling the truth in my own veins. I opened the vial. The faint, sweet chemical odor of diazepam drifted up. Sedatives. She wanted me drugged, incoherent, a vegetable for the lawyers to witness. "Drink, Mother, before I have to call the orderlies to assist you." I looked into her greedy, soulless eyes. In surgery, the first rule is to identify the necrosis and excise it. Elena wasn't family. She was an abscess. I brought the pill to my lips. My first incision had just been made. "I'll drink it, Elena," I whispered. for the sake of the family. The party was over. The war had just begun. The bedroom door clicked shut, finally severing me from the suffocating stench of vintage wine and the hollow toasts echoing downstairs. I leaned my back against the cold wood, taking a jagged breath to soothe the fury clawing at my chest. This room, once a sanctuary of intellect with medical journals stacked to the ceiling, now felt like a high-end holding cell awaiting an execution date. I looked at the opposite wall. My Harvard diplomas and the American Heart Association gold medals reflected the dim glow of the bedside lamp. They used to be my pride. Now, through Elena's eyes, they were just scrap paper pinned next to a rotting log. I walked to my desk. My hands began to shake, a natural reflex of a 75-year-old body flooded with adrenaline. But that was just the surface. Beneath it, the fine motor skills of a master surgeon were awakening. I placed Elena's amber vial on the desk. Under the surgical examination light, the pills looked slick and innocent, but I knew they contained a meticulously calculated death. Elena said I had heart failure. She wanted to use metoprolol to help me. But as an expert in cardiac electrophysiology, I knew exactly where she was aiming. She was targeting my SA node, the natural pacemaker tucked away in the right atrium. By swapping metoprolol with a concentrated mix of diazepam and digoxin, she wasn't just slowing my heart. She was deliberately inducing atrioventricular blocks. She wanted my cardiac action potential delayed, starving my brain of oxygen just enough to induce a fog, forgetfulness, lethargy, the perfect symptoms to label me with Alzheimer's or dementia, a chemical erasure of my identity. I opened a hidden compartment at the bottom of my private medicine cabinet and pulled out a bottle of genuine metoprolol I had stashed months ago. My hands began the swap surgery. One by one, the fake pills spilled into my palm, round, soulless, yet carrying a venomous conspiracy. I looked in the mirror and saw an old woman meticulously outsmarting a predator. Elena thought I'd obediently swallow my own destruction. She forgot that before she even knew how to hold a stethoscope, I was the one commanding life and death on the operating table. I grabbed the electronic blood pressure monitor Arthur had bought for me last month. I pried open the plastic casing, exposing the complex circuitry. With a pair of fine surgical tweezers, I skillfully rerouted the device's transmission system into the house's internal Wi-Fi. If they wanted to monitor my vitals, waiting for me to collapse, I would give them exactly the show I wanted them to see. But just as I set the circuit board down, a microscopic sound drifted from the hallway. The subtle creak of oak flooring, a sound only those accustomed to the silence of a hospital at night could recognize. I froze, holding my breath to keep my own presence invisible. Through the sliver of shadow beneath the door, a silhouette stretched across the rug. The figure stood motionless, shoulders slightly hunched, as if pressing an ear against the wood. It was Arthur, my son, the boy I had stayed up countless nights with to break his childhood fevers. The prestigious lawyer was now standing there, eavesdropping, waiting to hear if his mother had finally faded away under the drugs. The betrayal was no longer a distant diagnosis. It had metastasized beyond repair. I looked at the real pills on the desk, then at the shadow by the door. A premature ventricular contraction flickered in my chest, not from disease, but because my heart was making its own incision, excising the final traces of maternal instinct. This surgery, I whispered to my own reflection, will be performed without anesthesia. The early Boston sun bled through the slits in the curtains, landing on my face like jagged, clinical incisions. I lay motionless, my eyes glazed, staring at the ceiling as silver strands of hair splayed across the pillow like frayed nerve endings. Elena and Arthur thought they had won. They believed that after last night, under the calculated assault of diazepam and digoxin, I had become a non-entity, a crumbling ruin waiting for the wrecking ball. Then came the sound. The rhythmic, sharp staccato of Elena's stilettos against the oak floor. It was a sound of absolute authority. She stepped into the room, her expensive perfume mingling with the cold, sterile scent of antiseptic, the very smell I had spent a lifetime revering, now twisted into a symbol of high-stakes betrayal. "Mother, it's time for your morning meds," she cooed. Her voice was honeyed, but her eyes were surgical blades, scanning for a place to cut. I didn't answer. I allowed my jaw to slacken just a fraction, my lips twitching without form, mimicking a patient drifting into a pre-comatose haze. This was the dance of the apparent death. In nature, parasites mimic death to deceive their hosts. I was simply applying the same evolutionary strategy in my own home. Elena reached down and seized my wrist to check my pulse. I consciously surrendered every muscle fiber, employing the biofeedback techniques I had mastered during my years of neurological research. I focused on my diaphragm, forcing my breath to become shallow, erratic, creating the perfect physiological illusion of a body in systemic collapse. Pulse is sluggish, about 52 beats per minute. "Good," she whispered to Arthur, who hovered like a vulture in the doorway. "The cocktail is working. Her SA node is almost entirely suppressed." Arthur looked at me. His gaze flickered over the honorary degrees on the wall before settling on my aged, withered face. For a heartbeat, I saw a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. But greed is a fast-acting poison. It extinguished his last spark of conscience instantly. "So, she won't be able to interfere with the board meeting next week? With this dosage? She won't even remember her own name," Elena sneered. She forced the counterfeit pill into my mouth and followed it with a sharp splash of water. I swallowed. Or so they thought. In reality, the pill was tucked expertly beneath the fold of my gums, a trick used by psychiatric patients to bypass nurses. The moment the door clicked shut and their footsteps faded, I spat the toxin into a silk handkerchief hidden beneath the duvet. Now, the real surgery began. I sat up. The lethargy vanished, replaced by the predatory focus of a surgeon performing the most critical operation of her life. I pulled out the blood pressure monitor I had reconfigured the night before. I needed data on my own conduction system. I needed to know if my pacemaker was still mine. My hands shook not from the drugs, but from pure adrenaline. I wrapped the cuff around my arm and hit the switch. The numbers began to dance on the modified screen. My real heart rate, 74. Blood pressure, 125/80. Perfect. Robust. Defiant. Click. The sound of the doorknob turning made my heart skip a genuine PVC triggered by sheer terror. Arthur was coming back. Did he forget something? Or did the lawyer in him finally detect a flaw in the performance? There was no time to hide the device. In a split second, I collapsed back onto the pillow, pulling the heavy duvet over the arm with the cuff, while my elbow slammed into the power button. The machine emitted a tiny, sharp beep that sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive silence of the room. Arthur stepped inside. He scanned the room, his eyes locking onto the unnatural bulge beneath my blanket. Mother? What was that noise? I closed my eyes, mumbling incoherent fragments of a surgical nightmare. The artery. Must clamp the artery. Too much blood. So much blood. I was a masterpiece of drug-induced delirium. Arthur moved closer to the bed, his hand reaching out to whip back the covers. My breath seized. If he saw the wires, the circuit boards, the defiance, it would be over. I'd be institutionalized, chemically lobotomized, and buried alive in a private asylum. "What are you talking about, Mom?" Arthur asked, his fingers brushing the edge of the duvet. That was when I played my final card. I lunged forward, grabbing his wrist with a grip that shouldn't belong to a dying woman. My eyes were wide, vacant, staring through him as if he were a ghost. "Your father. He's standing right behind you, Arthur. He's asking, 'Have you forgotten the Miller Oath?'" Arthur froze. He was a man of hidden superstitions, a lawyer who feared the dead more than the living. His face turned an ashen gray, and I felt the cold sweat on his skin. He recoiled, looking over his shoulder in a panic. Using that split second of distraction, I used my foot to kick the monitor deep under the bed, hidden by the hanging dust ruffle. You're hallucinating again," Arthur stammered, his voice trembling. The urge to inspect the bed vanished, replaced by an urgent need to escape. He turned and fled the room as if pursued by a demon. I lay back down, cold sweat drenching my back. A temporary victory. I pulled the monitor back up from the shadows. The screen was still displaying the P waves and QRS complexes. But then, I saw something else. According to the blood test results I had intercepted through the house Wi-Fi last night, my creatinine levels were climbing unnaturally high. Elena wasn't just swapping heart meds. She was deliberately inducing a low-grade, acute renal failure, a calculated medical cruelty. By slowing my kidneys, she was ensuring the toxins stayed in my bloodstream longer, compounding their effect. It was a perfect, silent murder. I looked up at the diplomas on the wall. They weren't trophies anymore. They were warnings. My enemies were trained by the same masters I was. Elena knew how to kill without leaving a footprint on a coroner's report. But she forgot one thing. A neurosurgeon knows how to hijack her own electrical system to survive the dark. I pulled a small test tube from a hidden compartment in my vanity cream jar. I needed a urine sample for a private toxicology screen. I was going to prove that my confusion smelled of laboratory chemicals. This game of hide-and-seek couldn't last forever. They think I'm fading, but in reality, every cell in my body is fueling a fire of retribution. Every artificial rhythm I show them is just a shroud for a purge that will be more brutal than any surgery. Arthur, Elena, you chose the wrong patient for this procedure, I whispered into the darkness of the room, my eyes burning with a cold, clinical light. The darkness in the bedroom was oppressive, broken only by the flickering, sickly yellow light of the bedside lamp. I lay there, my breathing intentionally ragged, my eyes glazed over as I stared into the void. Elena stepped in. The mask of the caring daughter-in-law she wore for Arthur had been discarded. She tossed her white lab coat onto a chair, her face etched with exhaustion and the frantic, wild look of a predator backed into a corner. She sat on the edge of my bed not as a physician, but as an architect of death, observing the progress of the chemicals she had pumped into my veins. "Still awake, Mother? That old heart of yours is more stubborn than I thought," Elena whispered. Her voice was as cold as a scalpel sliding through skin. I didn't respond, letting out only a hollow, meaningless moan. Inside, every one of my senses was tuned like a high-tension wire. I had secretly activated the recording function on my digital hearing aid. Every word she uttered tonight would be the final nail in the coffin of her career. "You know, Arthur is truly a fool," Elena sneered, fiddling with the diamond ring on her finger, a ring I knew was bought with money embezzled from my research fund. "He actually believes I'm doing this out of concern for your health. But the truth is, I need the Miller Foundation. I need it to fill the black hole left by my miscalculations on the stock market. And those nights in Macau." A jolt of electricity ran down my spine. Not from fear, but from pure, cold disgust. Elena, the woman I once expected to inherit my medical legacy, was nothing more than a gambling addict hiding beneath a pristine white coat. "Do you know why I chose Digoxin, Mother?" Elena leaned down, her breath hot against my face, reeking of greed. "Because it creates these beautiful ST segment depressions on an ECG. It looks exactly like chronic myocardial ischemia. Even the top specialists can't tell the difference without a serum toxicology screen. And who is going to test the blood of an old woman already diagnosed with end-stage failure?" She traced a sharp fingernail down my gaunt cheek, the tip digging in like a threat. "The Miller Foundation will be mine before you take your last breath. I'm going to turn it into a financial empire instead of wasting money on your useless neurological experiments. You should be happy, Mother. At least your death finally provides some value to my net worth." Fury roared within me like a storm. I wanted to bolt up, to crush the throat that spat such poison. But I remained still. A surgeon knows. You do not let your hand tremble before the decisive cut. "Arthur will sign the papers in the morning." Elena continued her monologue, savoring her victory over a corpse that couldn't fight back. "He's too cowardly to face the fact that his wife is killing his mother. He chooses to believe my lies because it's easier than taking responsibility." She stood up and began rummaging through my jewelry boxes. "This pearl necklace. It will look stunning on me at the gala next week. By then, you'll be tucked away, silent and forgotten, in the hospice wing of the nursing home." Her soft, rhythmic laughter echoed in the empty room, a chilling sound. It wasn't the laughter of a human. It was the sound of a parasite that had finally drained its host dry. The moment she stepped out and the lock clicked into place, my eyes snapped open. The dull glaze was gone, replaced by the cold, hard glint of tempered steel. I removed my hearing aid and synced it to the phone hidden beneath the bed frame. Every confession, the debts, the manipulation of my ECG. I looked in the mirror. I still looked like a dying woman, but my heart was beating with a new rhythm, the rhythm of the hunt. Elena thinks she's using medicine to kill me, but she's forgotten the cardinal rule. A high-dose toxin is only lethal if the patient doesn't know how to neutralize it with superior intellect. "You've confessed, Elena," I whispered, my voice raspy but carrying the absolute authority of a professor. "Now, it's my turn to perform the amputation of your very existence in this family." The next morning, the air inside the Miller estate was thick, stagnant like an unresolvable hematoma. Arthur walked into my room accompanied by two men in unfamiliar white uniforms. My son's face was ashen, his eyes refusing to meet mine. His mother, sitting in a wheelchair, masquerading as a victim of a minor stroke. "Mom, Elena and I have discussed this thoroughly," Arthur stammered, his voice the sound of a coward clinging to a veneer of legality. "Your health requires 24/7 professional care. Green Pine is the best facility for your heart failure and your cognitive decline." I looked down at the paper on my lap. Voluntary admission and power of attorney. In medicine, this wasn't a treatment plan. It was a deportation order. Green Pine wasn't a prestigious nursing home. I knew it from old medical audit files. It was a velvet prison, a place where the wealthy were sent to be forgotten, sedated until their last breath flickered out in total isolation. "Sign it, Mother. Don't make this any harder than it has to be." Elena stepped forward, pressing a pen into my hand. She smiled, but her grip on my arm was so tight I could feel her fingertips sinking into my muscle. I looked at Arthur, letting a single tear track down my cheek. "Arthur, are you really abandoning me? I saved your life when you had meningitis at 5 years old. I stayed awake for 10 nights straight just to monitor your every breath." Arthur flinched, his shoulders trembling. But Elena intervened with the cold precision of a coordinator. "That's because she's no longer lucid, Arthur. Look, she's living in the past. Cerebral hypoxia from her heart failure is destroying her cognitive faculties." Elena leaned into my ear. Her whisper meant for me alone. "Sign it now, or I'll have Arthur initiate an involuntary psychiatric commitment. You won't get a VIP suite then. You'll get a padded cell with rubber walls." I took the pen with a trembling hand, scribbling my name onto the death warrant for my freedom. Inside, my disgust had reached its limit. I let them wheel me out, passing through the familiar hallways of the home I had built over half a lifetime. As the Green Pine private ambulance pulled away, I looked through the small, clouded window. Arthur stood there, shrinking into the distance, while Elena was already pulling out her phone, no doubt calling a real estate broker or her gambling creditors. 2 hours later, I was locked in a room on the 4th floor of Green Pine. The windows were sealed, no handles. The electronic lock engaged with a sharp click. This room held nothing but the pungent smell of chlorine bleach and the terrifying silence of a medical tomb. "Dr. Miller, here is your treatment schedule." A nurse with a vacant expression entered, carrying a tray of dark blue pills. Haloperidol. Elena didn't just want me lethargic. She wanted to induce extrapyramidal symptoms, stiffening my tongue and seizing my muscles, turning me into a literal mute before any potential inquiry. I lay back, faking the swallow while pressing the pill into the space between my gum and left cheek. I had to stay sharp. I looked up at the surveillance camera, its red light blinking. Elena thought she had severed all my connections, but she forgot a tiny detail she once complained about. My high-tech hearing aid was customized to filter operating room noise. It didn't just record, it had short-range Bluetooth capabilities. Just then, through the small meal slot at the bottom of the door, a thin slip of paper was pushed through. Not a prescription, but a torn piece of a lab report. I grabbed it with shaking fingers. It was a blood typing result. The patient's name was redacted, but the markers were clear. Mother, type O. Child, type A. My mind jolted as if struck by a defibrillator. In Mendelian genetics, a mother with type O blood, genotype00, can never give birth to a child with type AB, genotype. This was why Sarah had been sent abroad so abruptly. Elena didn't fear I'd take her money. She feared that I, a hematology expert, would realize Sarah wasn't a biological Miller. Elena had planted a stranger in this family and used her as a tool for inheritance. A pair of young, terrified eyes peered through the slot. It wasn't Sarah as a janitor. It was Sarah in the patient gown of the youth psychiatric wing on the floor below. Grandma. A choked whisper. Mom locked me on the second floor. Said, I have severe depression. I swiped this report from her files while she was on night duty. So that was it. Elena had imprisoned us both in the same building on different floors. She was using medicine to mercifully eliminate anyone who knew too much. Sarah, listen to me, I rasped, fighting the drowsiness of the haloperidol residue in my mouth. Don't save me with strength. Save me with charge. Do you see the defibrillator in the hallway? Sarah started to answer, but a harsh bark cut her off. Patient 402! Get away from that door. The heavy thud of security boots, the sound of Sarah being dragged away, her scream muffled by the violent slam of a door. I was plunged back into absolute silence. I was backed into a corner. Sarah was exposed. Elena would surely accelerate my end tonight with a dose of potassium chloride to stop this failing heart. I clutched the blood type report in my hand. This was evidence of adultery, of fraud, and Elena's own death warrant if I could get out. The blood in my heart pounded a painful, premature contraction. Elena, you calculated the pharmacology perfectly, but you failed basic genetics, and that will be the first incision in my surgical retribution. The silence in room 402 was carved only by the rhythmic clinical beep, beep of the patient monitor. The haloperidol was a heavy tide, trying to drag me into a bottomless sleep. But the memory of Sarah's face and that blood type report acted like a massive bolus of adrenaline. It kept my consciousness as sharp as a trauma surgeon on a midnight shift. I stared at the monitor. Green waves danced across the black screen. I knew Elena was watching this same feed from her phone, miles away or perhaps just downstairs. She was waiting for the sight of a heart fading into a flatline. But Elena had overlooked one thing. In these high-end, velvet prisons, every patient monitor is integrated into a central station via the internal Wi-Fi for rapid emergency response. I reached up with trembling fingers and covertly detached one of the 3 electrodes from my chest. Immediately, the screen flashed crimson. Beep, beep, beep. The vacant-eyed nurse from earlier rushed in. Dr. Miller, you've pulled the lead again, she grumbled, mechanically reattaching the electrode without a hint of suspicion. She didn't realize that in those few seconds while she adjusted the bed, my fingernail had already found the demo calibration button on the control panel. This was a mode intended for technicians, allowing intervention into the signal transmission frequency. I was no longer just a patient. I was a hacker within my own circulatory system. In medicine, a normal heartbeat has a sacred structure, the P wave representing atrial depolarization, followed by the QRS complex, the powerful contraction of the ventricles, and finally, the T wave of repolarization. I began a signal surgery, Using a technique of controlled apnea, combined with rhythmic tensing of my left bicep, I generated muscle artifacts electrical interference directly onto the electrodes. I wasn't creating a chaotic rhythm. I was composing a symphony in Morse code. Tense. Relax. Tense. The P waves distorted. The QRS complexes spiked and plummeted in a precise, intentional cadence. On the facility's central monitoring station, instead of a sleeping old woman, they saw an ECG that screamed, SOS. Sarah was on the second floor. She had been my lab assistant. She would understand. If she saw the monitors at the second floor nursing station jumping in a rhythm of 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, she would know her grandmother was issuing an order. Elena thought P waves and QRS complexes were just mindless biological markers. She never expected that through the hands of a professor of neurology, they could become bits of data. I was hijacking the Purkinje fibers in my own heart to talk to the building's Wi-Fi. But then, a tall silhouette darkened the frosted glass of my door. Not a nurse. Elena. She stormed in, clutching a tablet. Her face was contorted with rage as she stared at the screen. "What the hell are you doing to your heart rate?" she hissed through gritted teeth. Elena lunged forward, ripping the electrodes off my skin. "You think you can use these cheap tricks to call for help? No one here cares about your Morse code. All they see is an old woman with geriatric arrhythmia." She pulled a syringe from her pocket, filled with a clear, lethal liquid, potassium chloride. "You've become far too much trouble," Elena said, her eyes vacant of any humanity. A sudden cardiac arrest following a paroxysmal arrhythmia. A perfect diagnosis. No questions, no autopsy. She moved the needle toward the IV port in my hand. Suddenly, the building's intercom emitted a deafening, piercing screech. The hallway lights flickered and died. The Wi-Fi system, overloaded and compromised, crashed entirely. Outside, the frantic wail of sirens erupted, not just one, but a fleet. I smiled. A thin line of blood trickling from my dry lips. Elena froze, the needle just millimeters from my skin. "You're wrong, Elena," I rasped. "The Morse code wasn't for the nurses. It was for the automated fire alarm system. When you jam a monitor's electromagnetic wave at a specific high frequency, it triggers a false thermal alarm. And the police. They always arrive with the fire trucks." The door burst open. But it wasn't the police who stepped in first. It was Arthur. In his hand, he clutched the blood type report Sarah had given him. His face was no longer that of a coward, but of a man who had just realized he'd been nursing a venomous viper for 20 years. "Elena, how do you explain Sarah's AB blood type?" Elena stood paralyzed. The syringe of potassium chloride slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor. A sharp, clear QRS beep echoed from the rebooting monitor, sounding exactly like a final verdict. The atmosphere in room 402 shattered. The potassium chloride syringe lay in shards on the floor, its clear liquid spreading like the belated tears of a final betrayal. Arthur stood paralyzed, the blood type report in his hand trembling like a leaf in a gale. "Elena, answer me," Arthur roared, his voice cracking with agony. "Type O and type AB. How? Why?" Elena recoiled, her eyes darting frantically. For a split second, the panic vanished, replaced by the cold, murderous stare of a predator cornered. "You're going to believe a scrap of paper from a broken printer, Arthur? This old woman is using parlor tricks to manipulate you." I knew this was the moment. If I didn't act now, Elena would use her cunning to ensnare Arthur once again. I needed the ultimate evidence, a full confession. I began the vagal maneuver. I took a deep breath, trapping the air in my chest, and bearing down with maximum force the Valsalva maneuver. Simultaneously, my fingers covertly applied intense pressure to my carotid sinus on the side of my neck. In medicine, overstimulating the vagus nerve sends a powerful inhibitory signal to the heart's SA node. My heart rate plummeted 90, 60, 40, 20, and then a flat line appeared on the monitor. B, 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 B. The cardiac arrest alarm shrieked through the room, a soul-piercing wail. "Mom! Mom!" Arthur lunged toward me, his face turning a ghostly white. I surrendered my body to the performance. I rolled my eyes back, my lips turning pale from controlled apnea. I was inducing an extreme clinical syncope. "She's dead. She's finally dead," Elena gasped. But instead of horror, a sick, twisted smile flickered on her lips. She assumed the haloperidol combined with the shock had finally finished me. Elena stepped forward, shoving Arthur aside. She leaned into my ear, hissing with the voice of a demon. "Finally, you're gone, you stubborn old hag. You thought a blood-type trick could destroy me? Too late. Arthur, look at her. She died because she was weak, not because of me. This fortune, this house, and even that non-biological daughter. It's all mine now. Once I throw you in prison for her manslaughter, the board is clear." Arthur collapsed to the floor, devastated. You did this. You've been lying to me this whole time." "Yes, I lied." Elena laughed wildly, her arrogance blinding her. "You're just a cowardly pawn. I've planned this since Sarah was born. If this old woman hadn't interfered, it would have been perfect." In that instant, my eyes snapped open. I seized Elena's wrist with a strength she never expected from a dying woman. At the same time, the door burst open. Sarah stood there, her phone held high in livestream mode, flanked by 2 police officers and the city's forensic team. "We've recorded everything, Mrs. Miller," the officer stated, the cold steel of handcuffs snapping shut around Elena's wrists. Elena erupted into a frantic struggle, reaching for a glass shard from the broken syringe to strike. But Arthur lunged forward, tackling her. The collapse of a family played out under the frantic flashes of phone cameras and the rhythmic red and blue strobes of police lights. I sat up. The monitor behind me began to beep again, a steady, rhythmic 75 beats per minute. A perfect sinus rhythm. "Elena," I said, my voice calm but carrying the absolute authority of a judge. "In medicine, we call this apparent death. But for you, this is the very real end of a hollow performance." Arthur looked at me, then at Sarah, his eyes pleading for a forgiveness that wasn't there. I turned away, looking out the window as the first light of dawn began to creep into the dark rooms of Green Pine. I won this war, but the scars left behind would never truly heal. As Elena was dragged away, she turned back, a chilling smile spreading across her face. "You think it ends here? You have no idea who is standing behind my debts. He won't let you be, Professor. Not for long. A heavy, suffocating tension hung over the Miller Hospital this morning. An emergency session of the medical board had been convened in the Grand Hall. Elena, despite being out on bail pending investigation, had the audacity to show up as the acting CEO, attempting one final maneuver, a vote to liquidate the Miller Research Fund to launder her remaining assets. She stood at the podium, her makeup caked on to hide her hollow features, her voice dripping with a forced, plastic confidence. Professor Margaret Miller is currently mentally unstable. As her legal proxy, I move that. Boom! The heavy oak doors of the hall burst open. I stepped in. No wheelchair, no lethargy, no sign of the heart failure patient they expected. I wore my pristine white lab coat, with my 40-year service badge pinned firmly to my chest. Behind me walked Arthur, eyes steady, clutching a thick, black dossier. "The cognitive decline you're referring to, Elena." My voice rang out, authoritative and sharp, striking the hall into a stunned silence, was actually the result of systematic poisoning. Specifically, paroxysmal digoxin toxicity. I walked up to the podium and swept Elena's tablet aside with a single, cold motion. I projected a mass spectrometry report onto the massive screen behind us. This is an independent toxicology screen performed at the Central Forensic Institute immediately after I left Green Pine. I pointed to the towering peaks on the graph. My serum digoxin levels reached 4.5 ng/ml. That is a lethal dose for neurotoxicity and cardiac dysfunction, more than enough to induce a state of profound confusion or sudden cardiac arrest in anyone my age. A wave of murmurs erupted. My former colleagues stared at Elena with pure, unadulterated disgust. The fall began. Elena turned deathly pale, her voice faltering. That's impossible. You must have taken the wrong dose yourself. You're old, Margaret. You've lost control." I didn't take the wrong dose. I cut her off, my eyes boring into her soul. And here is the second exhibit. A digital recording of your own confession admitting to the drug swap and your plan to seize the foundation to pay off your gambling debts in Macau. Elena's own voice, raspy and venomous from that night in the ward, boomed through the speakers. Her malice, her greed, and her total disregard for human life were stripped bare before hundreds of her peers. Arthur stepped forward, slamming a divorce petition and a court-ordered asset freeze onto the table. "Elena, you are terminated from every position at this hospital, and the police are waiting in the lobby to discuss the $5 million you diverted from the fund over the last 2 months." Elena collapsed right there on the stage she had so desperately coveted. The sycophants who had once flattered her recoiled as if she were a contagious pathogen. Her downfall wasn't just about the money. It was the total erasure of her medical honor, the very thing she used to trample me. "Take her away," I ordered, my voice ice cold. As the police led Elena past the front row, she stopped abruptly beside me. She leaned in close, her voice trembling but still laced with poison. "You won this round, Mother. But the son of Cain knows you're holding the secret to that virus. He'll find you soon, Professor." "No." I froze. The son of Cain? A name I had never heard, yet it triggered a primal alarm in my synapses. a threat far greater than Elena. The hall erupted in applause to celebrate my return, but I felt a cold draft slide down my spine. I looked down at my hand, where the bruise from the haloperidol injection still lingered, a faint, purple reminder. This surgery isn't over. I've excised the primary tumor, but it seems the cancer has already metastasized into a world of shadows I am not prepared for. The lights in the professor's office at Miller Hospital were dimmed, leaving only the jaundiced glow of the desk lamp to fall across the faded honorary plaques. I sat there, facing Arthur. He looked a decade older in a single night, his shoulders sagging under the crushing weight of public humiliation. On the desk lay a crimson folder documented proof that Arthur had indirectly signed off on Elena's wire transfers, effectively legitimizing the medical malpractice at Green Pine. If this file reached the investigators, Arthur wouldn't just lose his legal career. He'd face a prison sentence for complicity. "Mom," Arthur rasped, his voice raw. "I truly didn't know she had gone that far. I honestly thought you were sick." I looked at him, my heart tightening. In medicine, there are cases where a surgeon must face a brutal reality. A part of the body has become so necrotic it is beyond salvage. "Arthur, did you not know? Or did you choose not to know?" I asked, my voice as cold as liquid nitrogen. "You saw me trembling under the drugs. You saw me being shoved into an isolation ward. And yet, you turned away. You chose a fragile, fraudulent peace over a painful truth." I slid the folder toward him. "Your future is in my hands. On one side, there is justice. You testify against Elena and accept the penalty for your weakness. On the other, there is a cover-up. I can use my influence to erase your tracks. But from this day forward, you will live as a moral amputee." Arthur stared at the folder, then at me. Tears of genuine remorse began to splash onto the polished wood. I stood up, walked to my son, and placed my withered hand over the left side of his chest. "Do you feel that, Arthur? Your heart is racing." That is sinus tachycardia, the physiological response to stress and guilt. When you live a lie, your sympathetic nervous system is in a state of chronic overstimulation, flooding your bloodstream with adrenaline and cortisol. The human body wasn't designed to endure long-term deception. If you choose to hide, this heart will fail faster than any poison Elena could devise. Arthur broke down, sobbing into my shoulder like the 5-year-old boy suffering from meningitis all those years ago. "Mom, I was so cowardly. I betrayed you. I betrayed the Miller oath." "Cowardice is a disease, Arthur, but it has a cure," I said, my voice softening but remaining firm. "The only antidote is confrontation. I need you to stand before the court not as Elena's husband, but as a citizen, a Miller. You must reclaim your dignity, for Sarah and for yourself." In that moment, Arthur's breathing began to stabilize. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot but carrying a flicker of integrity. He grabbed the crimson folder, his grip tightening. "I'll do it, Mother. I'll testify. No matter the cost, I want to be clean." Arthur's awakening was the final surgical cut, excising the malignancy that had been eating my family alive. I felt a lightness in my chest, a serene sinus rhythm spreading through my body. But the moment Arthur stepped out, My phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number. It was a single image. Sarah's silver locket, lying in a small pool of blood in the hospital's rear garden. Accompanying the photo was a text. "The son of Cain has come for his tribute. You have 30 minutes to hand over the viral sequence formula, Professor." The blood in my veins turned to ice. Arthur's redemption had barely concluded before the final, lethal war began. I realized then that Elena was merely a minor pawn in a ruthless biological chess game, and I was the one holding the king. 30 minutes. In medicine, that is the window of time before brain cells begin to die permanently after circulation stops. But for me, it was the thin line between honor and the absolute collapse of the Miller legacy. I didn't call the police immediately. The forces behind Elena weren't street thugs. They were the board of VaxCore, a multinational pharmaceutical titan hungry for my breakthrough gene therapy research. They had used Elena's gambling debts to turn her into a mole, and now they used Sarah as their final pawn to force me into signing away my life's work. I stepped into operating room 1, the cathedral where I had spent 40 years wrestling lives back from the grip of death. Under the blinding surgical lights, Sarah lay motionless. Standing over her was VaxCore's legal shark, clutching the contract that would sell my soul. "Professor Miller just signed the papers, and Sarah receives the antidote," the lawyer said, his voice as sterile as a financial report. I glanced at Sarah's heart monitor. The rhythm was dancing in chaotic, jagged spikes. It wasn't fear. It was a sodium channel blocker toxin they had injected into her veins. Her heart was spiraling into ventricular fibrillation, an electrical storm where the heart merely quivers, unable to pump a single drop of blood. "You think you can threaten a cardiac surgeon with death?" I calmly approached the defibrillator. In medicine, when a system goes rogue, we don't negotiate with it. We shock it back into submission. I charged the paddles to 360 joules. But I didn't aim for Sarah first. I swung the paddles toward the electronic control panel of the room, the brain of the security system, locking the only exit. Crack! A violent spark erupted. The electromagnetic lock short-circuited, and the heavy doors hissed open. In that instant, Arthur and the hospital security team stormed in. I didn't waste a second. I spun the paddles back and pressed them firmly against Sarah's chest. Clear. Sarah's body jolted. A massive surge of electricity swept through her, extinguishing the chaotic electrical storm. The monitor went silent for one agonizing second. Then, beep, beep, beep. A perfect sinus rhythm returned. I looked at the stunned lawyer. My research data was uploaded to the FDA and released as open source 5 minutes ago. You cannot monopolize it. You cannot hike the prices. As of now, its commercial value to you is 0. VaxCore lost billions in illegal investments. Elena faced a lifetime behind bars. 2 weeks later, I stood on the balcony of my office, looking down at the Miller Hospital campus. Sarah had recovered, starting her first lessons in medical ethics. Many have asked me how a 5-year-old heart could defeat the cunning of financial giants. I smiled, my hand brushing my old stethoscope. The wind from the Charles River blew against my chest, carrying the sharp, awakening chill of a Boston morning. Arthur walked in, setting a steaming cup of coffee on the desk. He didn't speak. He just looked at me for a long time, then gently touched my hand. "Mom, Is your heart rate okay? I smiled, looking past him toward the distant skyscrapers. I raised my hand, feeling the pulse at my own wrist, a dry, steady, but iron-willed beat. You know, Arthur, after all these years with a scalpel, I've realized the heart is the most mysterious thing. I took a sip of the coffee, feeling the bitterness vanish on my tongue. Many think a few milligrams of a drug can make it obey. They measure it, calculate it with machines, and pride themselves on mastering life. I turned to my son, my gaze calm but infinitely deep. Ending punchline. But they forget one thing. Machines only measure speed, not endurance. A doctor's heart doesn't beat for the numbers on an ECG. It beats for the sheer stubbornness to live to remain clean until the very end. I picked up the stethoscope and hung it around my neck. Let's go. Sarah is waiting for us in recovery. She needs to see that the Miller bloodline doesn't stain easily. I stepped out of the room, the sharp strike of my heels on the marble floor echoing with absolute certainty. No more lectures, just the footsteps of a woman who had performed surgery on her own destiny.